I'm Evan Smith, the CEO of the Texas Tribune. On behalf of my colleagues at the Trib, I want to welcome you to this year's Texas Tribune Festival. Every one of our 11 years in business, the work of our nonprofit newsroom has been critically important, but never more than in 2020. We produce reliable, credible reporting on issues that affect everyday Texans, making them better informed and motivating them to participate civically. You and people like you, readers, supporters, attendees at our events, make our public service journalism possible. If you value what we do, now is a great time to support us. Every dollar you donate up to $20,000 by September 30th will be matched by the Lowy Law Firm in Austin, and they'll give another $20,000 to the Central Texas Food Bank. Learn more and contribute today at texastribune.org/give. Now on with the show. I hope you enjoy this conversation between voting rights activist Stacey Abrams and Texas Tribune reporter Alexa Ura.
Greetings from Austin, Texas. My name is Alexa Ura. I cover demographics and voting rights for the Texas Tribune, and on behalf of the Trib, I am happy to welcome you to the 2020 Texas Tribune Festival. I am also pleased to welcome Stacey Abrams for a 30-minute conversation on the upcoming election, voting rights, representation, and the ongoing push and pull over who gets to exercise their power and who gets to keep it. Stacey is a voting rights activist and founder of Fair Fight Action, an organization focused on voter registration and voter access. She previously served as the Democratic leader of the Georgia House of Representatives and ran for governor of Georgia in 2018, coming narrowly close to becoming the governor and becoming the first Black woman to be elected governor of any state. Stacey, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So we are 6-ish weeks out from Election Day. Voters have started going to the polls for early voting in some states. Mail-in ballots are on their way to voters throughout the country and even overseas. As we sit here chatting virtually, how are you feeling about the state of this election? How are you feeling about the state of the democratic process that it hinges on?
I am concerned, but I believe we can mitigate the harm. We know that voter suppression isn't new. And unfortunately, this year in Texas and Georgia and around the country, we have seen a renewed commitment to limiting access for eligible citizens to cast their ballots. And when you have those attempts to limit eligible voters, not simply to stop expanding the vote, but to limit the access of those who already have this right, I'm deeply concerned about commitment and our belief in our democratic processes. But I'm also very strongly encouraged by the responses we've seen around the country. Voters who are now aware of the challenges to their right to vote, who are taking up the mantle and the charge of saying, this is my power and I will not let it be taken away from me. Voter suppression is real. The attempt to intimidate voters is real. The attempt to prevent or discourage voters is very real. But I remain optimistic that Americans will harness their capacity to protect our democracy by showing up and overwhelming voter suppression at the polls.
You know, acknowledging that voter suppression is systemic, right? It's not just one thing. It's not just one act or one instance of it. Are there particular venues for suppression or barriers that some voters already face that could be exacerbated by the pandemic? Are there issues that you feel are higher risk of being worsened in a pandemic general election?
Sure. So I spend a lot of time on this in my book, Our Time Is Now. I spend the first half laying out what voter suppression looks like. And it took half a book just to give us a bird's eye view of it. But the architecture of voter suppression, whether we're talking about its inception or its current iteration, is this. One, do you make it difficult for people to register and to stay on the rolls? Two, is it hard to cast a ballot? And three, is it hard to get that ballot counted? Those three components comprise the architecture of voter suppression. And so in the 21st century, in 2020 in particular, we can look to Texas. The fact that there had to be a pitched legal battle to finally force Texas to allow online registration is a very clear example of voter suppression, because by refusing to allow online registration at a time when most of the in-person venues were being closed or were hard to reach for voters during the pandemic or wannabe voters during the pandemic, that's deeply problematic. If we look at the issue of can you cast your ballot, that's the ongoing fight we're having over vote by mail. Texas, of course, again, is ground zero, but they're not alone. Right now, there are 41 states that allow for no excuses absentee balloting. That means there are 9 states that do not, which means that there are voters who risk contracting COVID or have other challenges, and they cannot use this very simple and safe method of voting. And then, does your ballot count? Across the country, there are lawsuits about fixing ballots. We know that during the primaries, 500,000 voters who attempted to vote by mail had their ballots rejected, meaning their votes did not count. And often these were simple mistakes, not understanding some arcane rules about where you put your signature or whether you could tape a torn envelope. Minor issues that can be remedied simply with notification should not be a reason for people losing their right to vote. We have to layer on top of that voter ID laws, poll closures. We know in Texas and Georgia, in Wisconsin, poll closures had a massive effect on the primaries that will roll into the general, and just confusion. The confusion over what the rules are, because in the United States, we do not have a single democracy. We have 50 different iterations amongst our states, which means that voters have to become experts in voting law if they are targets of voter suppression, and that should not be.
Yeah, I spend a lot of time talking to voters, often after they've had a problem, unfortunately. But even the voters that I catch before, the voters who will reach out with a question, they're either trying to figure out how to vote by mail for the first time. And I have been in a position where I'm literally sending links to people to download the application and walking them through the deadlines and how they can turn it in and what their options are. And I'm always kind of struck by the fact that it took this voter somehow connecting to a reporter who called them and they answered on a whim to get that information. And who does the onus of that fall on, right? Because, in a state like Texas, we have 254 counties. We have 254 either county clerks or election administrators that are actually running the elections. We have a Texas Secretary of State who oversees those elections. And then obviously we have elected officials. Who does the onus fall on to give voters the information they need to actually be able to cast a ballot?
The United States is an outlier. We are one of the few democratized, industrialized nations that puts not only the onus on the voter, but then we make the process of understanding it so deeply complicated because, to your point, 254 counties in Texas, 159 counties in Georgia, more than 1,500 election administrators in Michigan. We have a fractured system with just a labyrinth of administrative rules and bureaucratic hurdles that make it almost impossible for people who face challenges to find solutions. And that's one of the most insidious parts of voter suppression. It looks like user error. It looks like, well, you should have been able to figure it out. You should have known this is what was going to happen. You should have known that when you cross the border from Oklahoma to Texas, the laws changed and your rights changed. That is an absurdity in a democratized nation. The responsibility belongs on the government. It is a fundamental right in a democratic republic that you have the right to speak and pick your leaders. That means that the government itself should make it as simple as possible to exercise that right. There certainly will always be user responsibility, but it shouldn't mean that you have to get a degree in election law to cast a ballot. We know, for example, that when the documentary that we put together, All In, the Fight for Democracy, we had this idea, let's do a social impact campaign and let's collect information. We had to build an entire website called allinforvoting.com to help people learn how to vote. And we even had to have substrates for college students, for seniors, for military personnel, for returning citizens. Voting should not be this complicated, and it should not be partisan. The act of voting is a nonpartisan act. Our selections may be partisan, but the elections themselves should be easily accessible if you are an eligible voter. And part of the rigor is designed to cast people out of the system. No, they shouldn't have to find a reporter who is kind enough to respond. you should be registered automatically as a citizen. You should have clear information about where you go. And we know it works. If you look at what happens in Washington State and the state of Oregon, Washington sends you a guide to tell you who's on the ballot, what's on the ballot, how to get it done. Many states have found ways to be more proactive about engaging their citizens because they understand that government should work for the citizens, which means the government should be responsive to and inclusive of citizen needs.
Yeah, I remember talking to a professor at a local university here who used to have one day of early voting, and they were losing that because the Texas legislature had passed a law that you could no longer have temporary polling places. And the way she explained it to me, she said, obviously you have a responsibility. It could take some work, right? Voting may not be without any work. But the difference between walking across campus and having to walk more than a mile to get to your polling place, that is a significant difference. That's a significant more amount of work that you are requiring on someone who has this right. And I wanted to talk about, we know that voters are disenfranchised every election, right? People are left unable to register to vote, like you said, or they don't have access to a polling place near them, or they're unable to wait in a line for several hours to be able to vote. We know that those challenges aren't experienced equally, right? Voters of color and low-income voters so often bear the brunt of the barriers that are often baked into the system. We also know that there are ongoing efforts from the White House on down to foment mistrust in the election process. So how should we square standing by the integrity of an election and knowing that it actually isn't a fair process for some voters, right? How do you acknowledge the disenfranchisement without letting in these efforts to sow mistrust in an election that folks are working to make fair and to maintain the integrity of it?
Well, on November 16th, 2018, I took my first stab at it by acknowledging the legal sufficiency of the outcome in Georgia's election, but challenging the system itself for permitting that lack of access, that disenfranchisement to occur in the first place. We can't abandon our existing system hoping for better. The only way in a democracy to build a better system is to elect the people who will build a better system. And so my approach is first information. I've spent the last 2 years on a rallying cry tour to make certain people understood that it's not you. It's a feature of the system. It's not a bug. Voter suppression is real. You didn't imagine it. No, you shouldn't have had to figure out all of these complicated mechanisms in order to do something as simple as cast your ballot. And just using your example of poll closures, we know in 2018, according to an independent analysis, the closure of 214 polling places led to between 50,000 and 85,000 people not being able to physically cast a vote. Because it's not just as simple as going a mile down the street. If you don't have public transit, you don't have a car, and you're a shift worker who only gets 30 minutes or an hour where they won't dock your pay. And that's assuming you can physically reach the new polling place that you only learn about after standing in line for 3 hours at the wrong site. And so we have to recognize that it is a difficult system. It has been designed to be difficult. And that's why we have to elect people who pledge to make it easier, who pledge to make it more simply, more accessible. Number 3, we then have to hold those newly elected officials accountable. And that is going back and saying, yes, we elected you to make this possible, do your work. But the flip side to that is calling out the challenges when they occur. Part of the insidious nature, and I use that word intentionally, is that we internalize our concerns, we internalize our challenges, and we don't share it because we feel ashamed or despondent about what happened. But unless we call out what's occurred, then the disinformation and the misinformation and the distrust of our system flourishes because there's no counterweight. You have a president of the United States who lies about what's available. And I want to be very clear. He's lying about what's happening. If there is not a counterweight that says, here's the truth, and here's what it looks like, and here's what you can do, then misinformation will win out. But what I'm so excited about, the reason I've written the book and done the movie and done the podcast and do the interviews, is that if we start to talk about it, if we have the knowledge of our citizens, if they understand that it's not them, it is the system, then we are much more likely to have people who trust that the system can get better. But if they believe it is on them, if they believe that they are isolated and alone, then there is no need to fight, because most often people just give up.
You know, you're in Georgia, I'm in Texas. The demographics of the states in which we live are pretty different overall, but both have been labeled as either emerging battleground states or at least more competitive states for Democrats. This is happening as our electorates are becoming more diverse, as college educated women, particularly white women, are moving to the left. The change, though, to become competitive or to become battleground status depends on participation in elections, right? It depends on those people actually being able to be a part of the process. And you can't get there if the system doesn't work for everyone, or if voters of color continue to be disproportionately burdened by barriers to voting. So what's the model to follow here, right? You know, we both know that those in power are hardly eager to give it up, and that existing system is more likely to leave the status quo in place. So what's the model here to ensure that emerging electorates have the opportunity to be able to vote in states like yours and in states like mine?
Well, demography isn't destiny, but it is opportunity. And we know in the South, race is the strongest predictor of political leanings. So is age. So if you look at Texas, 43% of Texans are under the age of 30. 61% of those young people are people of color. That means there has been a dramatic shift building in the state of Texas. Similarly, in Georgia, right now we sit at about 33% African American, 9.5% Latino, 4.5% Asian Pacific Islander. In Texas, Latinos will comprise a plurality by 2022, roughly. We know that you have one of the fastest growing Asian populations in the Southwest, and you have a substantial Black population. And to your point, as well as other progressive or moderate leaning voters who lean left, we are building a plurality. But the only way we can transition that plurality into a majority is if we do the work of mitigating voter suppression, but also encouraging and sustaining voter engagement. It is not enough to say, go vote, it will change. We have to explain why voting works. And much of the work that I do, not only through Fair Fight and Fair Count and the New Georgia Project when I started that, and the work I do across the state and across the country, it's grounded by this basic notion that people will vote when they know what's in it for them. And so it's not enough to count on demography to tilt the balance. It's about doing the work that we see happening in Texas, work of not only getting people registered, but actually talking to them about why state-led races matter. The work that's being done by Beto O'Rourke, by Julian Castro to flip the Texas legislature, that's huge work, because part of it requires explaining to voters that 90% of the things you're concerned about didn't happen in Congress. They happened at the state and local level. So this is why you need to be engaged. I reject this notion that these are communities that will not vote. I believe that they will vote if we engage them, if we do the work. And my proof point is that in 2018, we increased youth participation rates by 139%. We tripled Latino turnout, tripled Asian Pacific Islander turnout, increased Black participation by 40%, and got the highest white participation for Democrats in a generation. That happened because we focused on actually engaging voters where they are, connecting the campaign of governor to the lives they wanted to lead, and then mitigating access to the right to vote, to push back against voter suppression as well as we could. Now, I still lost by 1.4% in the midst of having the Secretary of State run the election, the person who was the architect of most of that voter suppression. But the fact that despite him controlling the levers of power, we came within 54,723 votes speaks to the progress we're making. And so if we build this out to cover Texas, we know Texas has moved by more than 4 points since 2016. We know that the opportunities to win are there for those on the left, but we have to recognize that the right's not going to stop just because the demography is in our favor. We've got to be intentional in our investment and consistent in our approach, meaning that we can't disappear on November 4th and think, oh, well, it worked or it didn't. We've got to stay at it year in, year out. We've got to do it at the city level, at the school board level, at the county level, and at the state level, because that's the only way we create a permanent transformation of the electorate.
Yeah, I spend a lot of time thinking about those stats that you, which I'm quite impressed that you were able to to tick off. I spend a lot of time thinking about that because there's always this like sleeping giant idea of the Hispanic vote in Texas, which I generally reject and also emphasize that Hispanic voters are not a monolith. But I often think about, you say that the Hispanic voters are not turning out. But then that sort of ignores the part where, how do you prioritize people that you are reaching out to? Like, how does a campaign prioritize that? Well, they often pull a list of people who have voted before, people who have voted before in their party, people who have primary history. And we're talking about an entire group of people, particularly when it comes to young Hispanic voters in a state like Texas, that literally have no voter history, or you have who are older who have never been engaged, or people who have become citizens and are registering for the first time and have never been engaged by the process. And it seems such an odd argument to me sometimes when people say, well, Hispanic voters, they just like, they're so apathetic, they're never going to turn out. Why are we going to put our resources there? When it's really a lack of resources that has often led to some of the quote unquote apathy that you see.
You're exactly right. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. There's actually a term of art. There was a study done by Stanford University that said that 20% of the likely voters who would vote Democratic are considered unlisted, meaning they don't vote. So they may register, but they don't vote. So they get dropped off of the list to get a contact, to receive mail, to get a phone call. And because they don't get any of the information that we use to engage voters, they get left out of that process, which means they don't participate, which means they get left out of the process, which means they don't participate. In my campaign in 2018, we were very intentional about throwing out all of those metrics. We didn't use the traditional, high likelihood voters versus low propensity voters. We considered everyone who was on the rolls, who seemed to have a profile that could help us. Those were our voters. And so by being willing to go deep into the list to talk to everyone, we were able to transform the electorate. In Texas, it's about whether Hispanics are likely or not unlikely, if they're apathetic. In Georgia, it's Black folks. And in 2018, when I said we increased it by 40%, I want to put that in context. In 2014, the candidate for governor secured 1.1 million votes total from Democrats, running a fairly traditional Southern campaign, actually a fairly traditional Democratic campaign, talking to the folks who voted before to see if they'll vote again. In our campaign, we threw out the rule book. Everyone was a persuadable voter. And the difference was that instead of 1.1 million Democrats voting, I got 1.2 million Black people who voted and achieved 1.9 million people turning out, including increasing every other community of color that had been ignored, had been unlisted. The reality is our civic education in America rarely exists. And so the way most people learn about politics is through campaigns, people coming to their doors, knocking, asking for their vote. But if you are unlisted because you're young, because you are a low propensity voter, because no one ever talks to you, because you are a returning citizen and you don't know that you're allowed to be a part of the process, or simply because you're poor and you are transitional and you have to, you're transitory and you move from the apartment you were in the last time you voted and they can't find you. If we don't do the work of interceding and reaching voters who are likely to share our values, but need help in voting those values, then we will continue to lose. Because I agree with you, neither Blacks nor Hispanics are monolithic. Count an entire community based on the refusal of campaigns to do the work, then we lose out on the future opportunity of victory. And I reject that as a model. I believe we have to do the hard work of finding the enlisted, getting them involved. And that goes back to voter suppression, making sure they don't get kicked off of the rolls because no one has talked to them before and they didn't see a reason to vote. Once you're registered, you should stay on the roll so we can come back and get you. And then we come back again to tell you what we've done. And we come back again to tell you what we're going to do next. We have to be, as politicians and as folks who want to see change, we have to take it upon ourselves to foment that change, not assume it's going to happen sua sponte.
We're recording this the day after Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away. And because I'm thinking about voting all the time, I went back yesterday to read that line in her dissent to the ruling in Shelby County that gutted the Voting Rights Act. That line about how throwing out the tool that had been used for federal oversight of states with discriminatory histories was, quote, when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes, is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. Obviously, there are many unknowns on how a nomination by the president may move forward. But I live in a state where findings of intentional discrimination have come down against our Texas legislature, even after that ruling where the court decided that we were sort of past the discrimination that had needed to be policed in the past. So how are you taking stock of the justice's death, what her replacement could mean for the future of voting rights?
I'm saddened, of course, by her passing, but I reminded, the many texters, the folks who texted me yesterday, my response to them was that the court's composition shifted with the appointment of Brett Kavanaugh. We've needed her voice to remind us of who we are, but the balance had shifted, and the addition of another in the mold of a Kavanaugh is deeply problematic, but the efficacy of the change isn't really where our attention should be focused. We have to focus on the laws themselves. We have to focus on restoring the Voting Rights Act, because the Roberts Court said this is what you need to do to demonstrate the restoration of the Voting Rights Act. So let's elect a Senate that can restore the Voting Rights Act. We know what the flaws are in our democratic approach so that we actually have access to democracy in our country. The evisceration of the Voting Rights Act was so important because from the inception to our country until 1965, every fight was about trying to expand, defend, or create access to the right to vote. And then we had this halcyon period between 1965 and 2013, where the fight was simply to expand access and encourage engagement. And with the evisceration of Section 5, we found ourselves back in the defensive posture. I want to get out of the posture of defense. That's what Ruth Bader Ginsburg was arguing. But the courts are not the seat of power for how we create true democratic access. That happens in Congress, it happens in the White House, and that's where we have to focus our attention. If we want to honor her legacy, then we've got to fix the tools. And those tools are legislative tools, those tools are administrative tools. It's why I'm so focused on the 2020 census, because if we want to fix access, if we want to guarantee that we finally achieve our intended purpose of full access to democracy, then we can't be so fixated on one branch of government that we ignore and in reality abandon the obligations of the others.
We have just a few more minutes time talking a little bit about your future and representation. I have heard you speak about your possible plans. You have said at one point that you will likely run for president one day, that you see yourself doing the work you want to do more from an executive position than a legislative one. Does one day mean 2024?
One day means when we've gotten the work, when it's the right time for me. And part of which is fair fight, making sure we have an accurate 2020 census, which is under attack right now and has, I would say, almost as much of the work I do now speaks for why I should be allowed to do something else. And that's why when the opportunities come, if someone asks me a question, I'm going to be honest about my ambition, but my ambition doesn't drive my decisions to the exclusion of what needs to be done and how I can best be a part of making it happen.
Sure. Well, we're nearly out of time, so I just wanted to wrap us up by trying to remind voters about what they can actually do ahead of this election, right? I'm often asked, what can I do to make this better at a very, very practical level? And one of the things I often tell those people who are asking is to vote early, right? Do it so you're one less person in line when someone with less flexibility or someone who doesn't have childcare or who has two jobs tries to vote. Ahead of this election, what's your practical advice for voters at that very sort of grassroots practical level?
Number one, don't panic. we are going to see a slew of terrible headlines and be hit by terrible tragedies, including the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the attacks on the Postal Service. We're going to hear thousands of things. Don't panic. Number 2, make a plan to vote early. Exactly what you said, Alexa. Make that plan, but make a plan not only for yourself, but make certain that your friends and your families are also making plans. And then number 3, fill out the census. The state of Texas has a 61.7% self-response rate. That means Texas stands to lose, if the numbers are inaccurate, you can lose 3 new congressional seats and $304 million a year just for 1% undercount. That's billions of dollars stolen from the future of Texas, stolen from COVID recovery. And no matter where you live, we have to complete 4330-2020 to save the future. Vote and be counted in the census. Make a plan and don't panic, and we can get there.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. Stacey, thanks so much for joining us. For those of you watching from Texas, a reminder that the deadline to register to vote is October 5th. Early voting begins on October 13th, and mail-in ballot requests are due by October 23rd. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye, y'all.
Take care.